fact, there's even a demand for trophy office buildings. An index for commercial property values by Green Street Advisors, which is tilted toward high-end properties, has risen more than 45% from its 2009 lows. In fact, it's only 10% below its all-time highs. It's not just buildings that are on fire. Even the market for very fertile farm ground in Iowa is doing very well. 120 acres just changed hands on October 4th for the highest price ever paid in Northeast Iowa for farmland at $16,750 per acre. Price of land to grow corn on is up nearly 13% just in the last 6 months. Now, that's at the same time that the price of corn, which is actually grown on that land, has dropped from $8 a bushel to about $6.50 a bushel. As farmland auctioneer Del Beyer says, sometimes the math doesn't make sense in these deals. It's speculative money, it's cheap money running into farmland, just like it's running into everything else. But this is the way it always works. More money out of nowhere means more bubbles, more booms, more busts. In fact, we could go back to John Law's Mississippi bubble. As banknotes were created, shares of the Mississippi Company were floated. In fact, so many banknotes were issued, the printers and the clerks couldn't even keep up. But speculators like Richard Cantillon made fortunes as the price of the Mississippi Company actually went up 20 times. And then, of course, crashed. Cantillon was among the first to buy in, and he was about the first to cash out. He was a friend of Law's, and it's thought that he had a little insider information going in, bought his shares cheap, and later he benefited again with information that his brother provided. Bernard Cantillon actually supervised the prospecting party that had sailed to Louisiana. If you remember the Mississippi Company, that was one of their primary asset, was anything in Louisiana in the New World. And Law's propaganda had said there's a land of riches and gold, and that was the propaganda. But Bernard Cantillon knew that instead, when they found their way to Louisiana, it was instead disease and hostile natives is what they found. So Cantillon realized that this bull market was based on little more than smoke and mirrors and ever-increasing quantities of paper money. Now, many others ran for the cover of silver as well. Vendors were not interested in taking paper, did so only at a discount. Livestock sellers would only take silver and gold. Price inflation was rampant. Prices rising 25% in just a matter of months. And in fact, the price of bread, very much a staple at that time, soared 300 to 400%. So while the speculators got rich, those who got out got very rich, the common person was just paying the price with higher prices. Now in Weimar, Germany, all of those in debt, all of those who knew how to speculate in the stock exchange, and all those who possessed foreign currency and could transfer money into material assets had a good chance to profit from an inflation. And those are the words of Bernd Wittig, who wrote a book called Culture and Inflation in Weimar, Germany. And the German stock market, we hear a lot about the inflation in Weimar, Germany. We don't hear a whole lot about the stock market at the time. But the German stock market stood at 97 in January of 1919. By January of 22, it was at 743. But by December, it actually rose to 89.81. So from 1914, 1922, the stock market rose 89 times during this hyperinflation. But would you have been better off in stocks or better off in the dollar? You've been better off in dollars. The dollar versus the German currency rose 1,525 times. Or you'd been better off in coal, because it rose 1,250 times in that period of time. Wedig points out that the biggest debtor after World War I was the German government, which owed 154 Reichsmarks to its creditors. When the inflation ended November 15th, 1923, this enormous sum, adjusted for 1914 purchasing power, was worth only 15.4 pfennig. Essentially, virtually all the debt had been inflated away. And as he writes, the German state was probably the biggest winner in the inflation, since all those who had lent their money out of patriotic duty received only a fraction of their investment back. But they weren't the only winner. With cheap loans available to big businesses, large segments of the German industrial economy benefited as large firms were actually able to buy up small firms that were in trouble. Essentially, it was like a takeover binge that we see currently. Through clever investment and ruthless speculation, a handful of businessmen, profiteers created great industrial conglomerates within only a few years, writes Wedig. One observer called the five biggest industrialists the kings of inflation. In fact, Hugo Stein's the richest and most powerful industrialist in Germany at the time, justified inflation as a means of guaranteeing full employment. Same thing we hear out of the Fed right now. Not as something desirable, but simply as the only course open to a benevolent government. It was, he maintained, the only way whereby the life of the people could be sustained. Now, after the market peaked in late 1922, over 1 million Germans were actually speculating in the stock market. And this is what happens in a hyperinflation. When you have inflation at all, people begin to want to speculate instead of working hard. And they were engaged in speculation and with their dealings mainly through what was called Winkelbankers. They were backstreet operators who sprung up with the inflation, actually made their living entirely by trading foreign currency. And although they weren't members of any exchange, they actually played a significant part in setting the exchange rates that were generated first in Berlin and then New York. At the end of July in 1923, German shares had presented themselves as a popular, though unstable, repository of wealth, but shareholders were actually a good deal poorer than what they thought they were. The fact that this impoverishment was actually largely veiled by these gigantic increases in their stock portfolios. But the fact is, even though their stocks were up, the price of everyday necessities had gone up even faster. Now, some got rich in the black market during this period. Farmers profited actually from barter, and they were able to gain great wealth that way, and because they had real goods, they had real assets to trade with. A few years ago, of course, we in Germany was back in the early 1900s, 1919, 1920, but just a few years ago, we had a situation in Zimbabwe. We had negative real interest rates in Zimbabwe, and this caused the same thing to happen, for people to move their money from money market instruments to equity and then to buy up residential real estate. These pricing bubbles were exacerbated by the emergence of a growing class of speculators, according to the IMF, with access to bank loans at negative rates of real interest. In particular, the RBC subsidized credit scheme added liquidity to the financial system, helped to fuel the asset price bubbles, as the low-cost resources had been used in part by exporters to buy shares on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange or in real estate. Negative interest rates also encouraged an attitude of buy now rather than wait, further contributing to the acceleration of inflation, according to the IMF. It's hard to imagine that the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange was actually the best performing stock exchange in 2007, but a financial commentator, John Paul Koning, wrote at the time in April of 2007, the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange is the best performing stock exchange in the world, with the key Zimbabwe industrials up some 595% since the beginning of the year. And in the last 12 months, the index has been up 12,000%. This jump in share prices is far in excess of increase in consumer prices. While the country is crumbling, the Zimbabwean share speculator is keeping up much better than the typical Zimbabwean on the street, he wrote. Now, I don't know if you remember the central banker who was in charge of the Zimbabwe Central Bank, but his name was Gideon Gono, and he actually closed down the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange in November of 2008. And he said, unless there is more discipline and honor, the exchange will stay closed. I can't be bothered, he said. He didn't know when it would open. And what he did was he commissioned a study. Gono was a guy who wanted to blame everything from the weather to reparations to actually now the stock market for inflation. Printing money, he didn't think had anything to do with price increases. And so he had this study commissioned, and the study came back, unsurprisingly, with the conclusion that argued, quote, that the stock market has traditionally been one of the drivers behind Zimbabwe's hyperinflation. So these days here in America, bankers have been kind of stingy in terms of lending to real people and real businesses. Total loans actually have been flat. But at the same time, bankers can't get enough of lending the U.S. government paper. In fact,